We now have some credible reports that the Ukrainians are using chemical weapons. The Ukrainian forces that broke through started out with 1,000, and then it added another 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000. It's ridiculous. I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, except for a couple of things. Pleaded over and over and over again for a no-fly zone over the area, over Ukraine. Well, that's not going to happen. That's impossible. He would go to rallies in 2016, and every rally he attended, there was this thundering response: build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. Americans have lost their very reasonable fear of war. Absolutely was horrified at the prospect of any kind of nuclear exchange, knowing full well the poisonous impact of it. Doesn't give me much hope for any sort of rational approach in the future, Dan. During World War II, in fact, my father was serving on one of those vessels. Why are they building aircraft carriers? Are they building it because they want to attack us? No. All of that. Let's get back to strategy. There's no point in attacking China. It doesn't make any sense. Well, admittedly, the entire discussion was not terribly nuanced or informed, and certainly not by any means sophisticated. So the only thing I can say is that his views are sadly not very different from most congressmen on the Hill and from a lot of senators. None of these people have very sophisticated views of events overseas, and particularly of Russia or Iran or Turkey or China or any of these places. Most of them never been there, and if they were there, they were tourists, flew in, flew out. So I'm not really surprised, Dan. And remember, as we've talked so often, Americans have lost their very reasonable fear of war. You know, as we've talked before, when I was growing up, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember what people did, how people felt, and their concerns. And obviously, President Kennedy was extremely concerned and alarmed by the statements of people made that, like Curtis LeMay and the chief of naval operations at the time, because he absolutely was horrified at the prospect of any kind of nuclear exchange, knowing full well the poisonous impact of such a thing. So, you know, he represents, I think, Pete Hegseth, who is a very nice guy and gives a good rousing speech in support of Trump when he was on the campaign trail, is just expressing views in a way that I think is not very different from a lot of Americans. Well, I think he reflects the attitude that's developing that we've wasted enough money on this enterprise. He says, well, I don't think he'll go much beyond Ukraine. That's fine. And he's not going to go much beyond the Dnieper River unless, we compel it. So that's fine. But this, again, is blowing with the wind in Washington. The wind has changed in Washington. The money is drying up. No one wants to stand up and say what a catastrophic error this was and admit the folly. So everybody sort of says, well, that's enough. We've done all we can. And they walk away. We did that after Vietnam. Very little accountability is involved. It doesn't give me much hope for any sort of rational approach in the future, Dan. I mean, come on, let's face it. It's easy to say now, well, I guess that's not going to work. Thanks very much. I mean, look at the legions of people who are saying, well, I guess Ukraine can't win. And just 6 weeks ago, they were hard over, and he wasn't any different. Let's give more strike weapons to the Ukrainians so they can do more damage to the Russians. That was something from Waltz when he was in Congress just a few weeks ago. Now he's changed his tune. It doesn't give me any confidence that we have anybody thinking entering these offices. In January 1997, when Breaking the Phalanx was published, I had a whole chapter on a war in CENTCOM, and I compared the Navy's position to that of our ships off the coast of Okinawa during World War II. In fact, my father was serving on one of those vessels and sat under the hail of kamikazes that flew in. The kamikazes sunk something like 9 ships, damaged another 26 or 27. It was a very frightening experience. And my point was, what you saw with the kamikazes, make it, sort of cube it, and then make it much more lethal. and large numbers of shore batteries consisting of cruise missiles and unmanned, what a cruise missile is essentially an unmanned attack system. They'll sink most of these amphibious ships and other kinds of vessels and changing warfare. Well, that was in 97. Of course, I was pilloried and the Navy renounced me because I was arguing for no more aircraft carriers. Don't build anymore. Let's use these until retirement because they're only useful as in a permissive environment. That's true. But he's saying that now, and of course, more and more people have come on board with this idea. I think Andy Krepanevich had the idea of an arsenal ship, which wasn't all that bad. It looked something like the Monitor from the Civil War and just carried lots and lots of missiles that it could launch. But the truth of the matter is submarines rule the waves, and our preeminent priority strategically should be the building of additional submarines and the maintenance of that fleet, certainly the maintenance of the human capital. That goes into another discussion.
Yeah,
that's important. I don't think he knows anything. I think he's mouthing things. That goes on in Washington a lot. Most people in Washington have a cocktail level of familiarity with anything. And you go to the cocktail party and you pick up on what's the theme. And so targeting aircraft carriers, that's an easy theme right now. People point to that sort of thing. The thing he doesn't understand is that guess who's building aircraft carriers? The Chinese.
Yeah.
Now, why are they building aircraft carriers? Are they building it because they want to attack us? No, because that's seen as a metric of your greatness as a great power, just as battleships in the 1930s were viewed in the same way. Adolf Hitler wasted precious time and resources on battleships, the Bismarck, the Gneisenau, and they were great ships, but they were no longer necessary.
Yeah.
Had he plowed all of that into submarines, he could have begun the war with more submarines. He had something like 29 operational submarines when the war broke out. And people have run those war games and said that if Adolf Hitler had had 50 plus submarines at the beginning of the war, he'd have won. He'd have sunk everything.
Wow.
That's the war game that he should be interested in paying attention to. That's the lesson of the Second World War. And Nimitz said as much at the end of the war. He said none of us appreciated the lethality and importance of the submarine. And Nimitz had commanded a submarine. So that's nice, Pete. Great. That's not part of a larger strategy. It is no new strategy. If there's no new strategy, you can't get a new structure. If you don't have a new structure, you're not going to get new people. You're just putting one or two people here or there that you think are going to lead somewhere new. It doesn't work that. Well, I'm glad that somebody's finally wakened up and started talking about the folly of war with China, because my point on China from the very beginning has been that there's an old saying in the Navy, a ship's a fool to fight a fort. In other words, if you think your ships offshore are going to demolish a well-fortified site that's ashore with all the equipment and capabilities and weapon systems to fight back, you're wrong. You're going to lose. China is the largest fortress in the history of mankind. And all of their investments in shore batteries and missiles makes it very, very dangerous for us to approach China. And that's the whole point. We talk about this denial strategy that the Chinese have invented, or they haven't really invented it, but adopted. And we keep talking about how we're going to break through this denial strategy and win the war. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. You can't do it. They've got more missiles than we have ships. They have more capabilities to hurl at us than we have ships. But the truth is that with 7 or 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, you could shut down all the commerce that goes in and out of China from the sea. Think about that. So the notion of building more surface ships at this stage for that kind of purpose makes no sense. But that threat is understood by the Chinese. They're working very hard to try and make some breakthroughs in anti-submarine technology. Now, having said all of that, let's get back to strategy. There's no point in attacking China. It doesn't make any sense. Asia is not interested in war. Nobody in Asia wants to go to war. This is the great myth that is perpetrated in Washington to justify out-of-control defense spending. This is where you get people like Elbridge Colby, who for years has been talking about the war with China. He thought he could become Secretary of the Navy and then ultimately preside over some wasteful buildup of the surface fleet to reenact whatever happened in the 1960s or 70s, to realize Admiral Zumwalt's dream of a carrier-based fleet attacking the Russians on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Well, that was fine for Admiral Zumwalt, and he was a brilliant man, but that makes no sense now. So you need a different strategy, and we have to get past assuming certain states are enemies and others are friends. We live in an environment where everyone is a limited liability partner. That means that we share interests with most people most of the time. We want access to the global commons, space, the atmosphere, the oceans, and so forth. That's what's important. And we ought to be interested in that. And we should be interested in avoiding unnecessary conflict because it's destructive. We've lost, 14 trillion since 2001 on these crazy wars in the Middle East. And you and I sat in the desert in 1991 when victory was declared, long before anything of real importance had happened. And what was really important? It was the decapitation or removal of the people in Baghdad. Okay, you put in another bunch. You offer control to a new group of generals, invite the UN to come in and hold elections, and you get the hell out. That was something that should have happened in 2003, but we were fighting for different reasons. We were trying to make the entire Middle East, along with much of the world, safe for Israel. It hasn't worked very well. It's made matters much worse for Israel. And that's been obvious to me and to many Israelis since 2003. That's mixing apples and oranges. Well, Afghanistan was irrelevant, but Ukraine is really important. Why? We have no long-term strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. Nobody in Europe does. Everybody in Europe wants to do business with Ukraine and Russia and White Russia. Why? Because of the things they have. That's what the great marriage of Germany to Russia was always all about, a mutually beneficial arrangement, much like the one that exists today between Russia and China. We need to get out of this. We don't fit into it, and it's not in our interest, but we need a new strategy along the lines that I've discussed. Well, you just listened to the Israeli mantra. That is exactly the argument that they make. And then they go on to insist that their war is our war, that our interests and theirs are identical. It's a dangerous path because most of his comments are taken, if you take them out of context, they don't make much sense. And the context is something that everybody ignores that wants to go to war with Iran. And that's what this is all about. And if you want to benefit from what I would call Israeli largesse, which is really Jewish capital in the diaspora, then you have to sign on for the war with Iran. And that's what he's done. That's what he's about. It's unfortunate because it's very simplistic. I remember people that were cheering that we had killed Soleimani in Iraq. And I pointed out that there were a couple of problems with this. First of all, Soleimani technically was a member of a foreign government. He was the equivalent of the national security advisor to the supreme leader. So it's essentially the same as if someone killed Waltz and then cheered in the streets. Look what we've done. Dumb idea. It was wrong. It was against international law. It was actually against our own laws. Secondly, well, he's responsible for all these American deaths in Iraq. No, he's not. What he did is what we would do if we had an enemy in Mexico. What would we do if there were Russian or Chinese forces in Mexico backing one side against another side in Mexico, and the other side being perhaps a more moderate or liberally minded group versus a group that wanted to not only capture control of Mexico, but then wage war on us? I think we'd have been much tougher on our enemy in Mexico than the Iranians ever were on us in Iraq. You can't isolate these things. He's talking about warfare that is precise and clean and sterile. That doesn't exist. You can't bomb things with impunity. We can't bomb our way out of anything, neither can Netanyahu. This is a dead end. And if we keep it up, we're going to end up at war with a pretty substantial portion, not just of the Middle East, but probably of Asia and Russia. And this is unnecessary. It's counterproductive. It's antithetical to our interests. We're not ready for it. We're not prepared. Putin, for whatever reason, has been extraordinarily tolerant of all sorts of insanity on the Ukrainian side. And he's now announced that there will be no negotiations with Kiev. So if there was any chance for a successfully negotiated settlement of matters between Russia and Ukraine, at this point with the Zelensky regime, that's over. And of course, all of this goes back to NATO. And you have to stop and ask yourself the question, watching Ukraine and its behavior, why would we want a rogue state like that inside the alliance?
Right.
And again, this belies the sort of, or reveals the lie about the alliance. It was always supposed to be defensive. It's been turned into a Trojan horse for American offensive operations. Just want to sign on for that. Version into the region that we usually refer to as Kursk, into that area, is not a major military event at all. I think the mainstream media is playing this up as though it's the German advanced vanguard or something is broken through and will be on the channel in a few days. I mean, this is the Ukrainian forces that broke through, and then it added another 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000. I think we provided them with some satellite-based reconnaissance that pointed to an area that was very lightly defended, and they thought they could break through. Their real objective seems to have been to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. That has failed, obviously. They did damage the cooling system, but that seems to be under repair, and so there's no danger of a meltdown at this point. And I think it's more of an irritant and an annoyance than anything else. And then, of course, a public relations ploy to try and create the illusion that there's something left in the Ukrainians, that they have some fight in them, and we should continue to sort of throw our money into the black hole called Ukraine. It's ridiculous. I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, except for a couple of things. We now have some credible reports that the Ukrainians are using chemical weapons, and precisely, it looks as though these are 155 millimeter shells, the standard. The chlorine is pretty nasty stuff for a whole range of reasons. It reaches the ground, it sinks into the earth and poisons the area for years.
Wow.
So this is more than just the usual mendacity. This is dangerous and crazy. And of course, it contravenes international law. We outlawed the use of chemical weapons a long time ago. Of course, that hasn't stopped the Ukrainians, and we've already seen them target civilian areas while they were plowing their way into Russia. Again, all of this is not really covered in the mainstream media the way it should be. That in 1991, when the operations began against Iraq, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pointed to the chemical weapon, and she made it very clear that if he was contemplating using those, that he could then expect a nuclear response from Britain. So, I wouldn't exclude any possibility at this stage, but I think this is probably the last straw for Putin on the Ukrainian side. And he's now announced that there will be no negotiations with Kiev. So if there was any chance for a successfully negotiated settlement of matters between Russia and Ukraine, at this point with the Zelensky regime, it has persuaded Putin that he has to deal directly with Kiev. That is, he's going to have to launch an offensive that goes toward the capital and ultimately removes this regime. If it's not removed, then at least it will flee to some other location. And remember, Zelensky has pleaded over and over and over again for a no-fly zone over the area, over Ukraine. Well, that's not going to happen. That's impossible.
Right.
But I hear in the back discussions again about creating some sort of enclave for the fleeing Zelensky government in Western Ukraine, with Lvov as the alternative capital, which is just across the border from Poland.
Right.
So I think that could be under consideration. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to sort truth from fantasy. And there's a lot of fantasy right now because we're in no position to intervene in this conflict. Far from it. We're very focused now on the Middle East with whatever assets we've got. But most of the ground force in the army that can fight is sitting along that border between Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Russia, and some down in Romania. But it's not enough to make any difference in a collision with 800,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. President Trump. The last time around, he didn't seem to grasp the importance of personnel as policy.
Okay.
And he appointed repeatedly people to high office that did not agree with him. who actively subverted him and frankly prevented him from doing very much that he wanted to do.
Right.
Now, that's his fault. He picked them, and once they demonstrated who they really were, he didn't fire them. So it raises serious questions about his judgment.
Okay.
Secondly, he would go to rallies in 2016, and every rally he attended, there was this thundering response: build the wall, build the wall, build the wall.
Right.
So everyone's expectation was that, based on his rhetoric and what was said at the rallies, that as soon as he got into office, he would immediately go after the border,
Right.
shut it down, build the wall, police it effectively. What did he do? He went after Obamacare. I think people need to then, as I said, listen carefully, but also step back and judge what happened at the time and understand that what they're hearing may not at all be what happens.
Okay.
And he still has people like Pompeo within his orbit.
Right.
Robert O'Brien is acting as his principal national security advisor. Whether he'll end up as Secretary of Defense or something, I don't know. You have Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton from Arkansas, who very much wants to be president, but certainly is willing to take over the Department of Defense. And he's been beating the drums and leading the charge with millions of dollars behind him from AIPAC.
Right.
For war with Iran forever.
Right.
And all of these people have unreasonably bellicose views toward President Trump.
Right.
But if it's not what you want, then you need to think carefully about the alternatives. Now, as far as Harris is concerned, I don't know why anybody would pay any attention to anything the woman says. She's obviously got some smart people writing for her now.
Right.
But she can't think on her own. She can't stand on her own 2 feet and say anything that makes any sense. She can't present a coherent policy picture of anything. So I don't think Kamala Harris represents the people who are actually behind her. I think she's just a facade. She's there to convince people to vote for her, but she doesn't represent what's likely to happen. Okay. If you re-elect Biden in Harris form, the same people who've been bankrolling everything over there to this point, the same wealthy figures, hedge fund managers, billionaires who desperately want our borders to be open, who want to destroy our national identity and culture and so forth, they're going to be running the show. They will continue to fight the war in Ukraine. Now, what will they do in the Middle East? It's anybody's guess, but I don't see them abandoning Israel, contrary to popular belief.
No.
So right now, if you look at those two candidates, I'd say that they are two wings of the same uniparty. One is on the left and one is on the right. The only man out there who is remotely independent and capable of doing anything differently is RFK Jr.
Right.
Now, what he's going to do, I don't know. But I mean, I think he's decided to stay in the race. And I think he is somebody who has got answers. I hope he gets on the debate stage. If he's on the debate stage with the other two, it's a no contest because he's studied the issues. He has a grasp on the matter, and he has answers. The others just have sloganeering and sound bites under control of BlackRock, which is what's happening in Ukraine right now. Zelensky is selling off Ukraine to the highest bidders in the West. BlackRock-like organizations who want to go in there and strip out whatever Ukraine has. I think the idea was let's defeat Russia and then strip Russia of her mineral resources, her agricultural resources, her capabilities, and then divide Russia into a set of sort of vassal states.
Right.
It's all failed miserably. There was no chance of that happening. But it's interesting that people in Washington would think in those terms. Of course, they dress it up in all this sort of meaningless language about democracy, which in Washington means if you agree with me, you have free speech. If you don't, there's no free speech. So we may well see a major war in the Middle East. I'm amazed at the ability of the Iranians to restrain themselves despite incredible provocations. I'm amazed that not more has happened given the relentless attacks on Gaza that result in people being killed every day. And people are now suffering with disease and every imaginable ailment that you would expect when everything is destroyed in terms of infrastructure. So I don't see how we actually avoid a major war in the Middle East. And we are obviously contributing to it because we're sending more and more firepower in that direction, indicating that we don't really care about a negotiated settlement. We're doing what Netanyahu wants. People that talk about a breach between Washington and Netanyahu must be smoking some crack, because I don't see any breach.
Right.
I think they may say that to try and soften the blow, but the truth is that Netanyahu is in control of our armed forces. Right. He's calling the tune. And I think he's going to get his war. Unfortunately, we're going to be dragged into it. How long it lasts is anybody's guess. I don't have an answer, but the point is, I think that's probably coming. Now, when you go back to Ukraine, that's a different animal, because there is a real possibility that the governments in Western Europe are overthrown, that these globalists are sent packing.
Right.
And you get new governments, new regimes, and they say, that's enough. We've had enough. We want an end to this. I think that's in the offing in Germany. It hasn't happened yet, but I think it's coming. It's well underway in France, certainly underway in Great Britain to some extent, although it looks like they are very much in the uniparty mode. So they're going to have to expel the uniparty from power in London. Right. God bless them. I wish them the best.
Right.
What we're going to do is get an education regarding what the armed forces are going to do, because ultimately, the French army has always existed to defend the French state, but it has not hesitated to intervene when it thought that the French people and the French nation were in jeopardy or being betrayed. The question is, what happens in Great Britain? Again, all of these people have been systematically disarmed. It's why when I talk to various audiences, I point out the Second Amendment, which grants us the right to bear arms, is ultimately the foundation for all the Bill of Rights.
Right.
All the other amendments depend upon it. We're armed, thank God. The lesson from looking at Europe right now is that nobody's armed over there, and they are at the mercy of these governments and their armed forces and police. The police, again, what kind of organizations are they? How much do they care about the people that they're supposed to police? I saw an excerpt from a short comment made by a policeman in Britain, I think somewhere in England, who was saying that they wanted to prosecute Americans who were exchanging emails with people in England on the topic of what is happening and theoretically encouraging the English to fight back against this globalist movement in England. Well, he thinks they should be in jail too. I mean, very shortly, unless people organize and demand it, we're at risk of nobody having a Republican style government anymore in the West. I mean, your notion of free speech will be completely gone, and when that goes, we've had it.
Right.
Modern society without it. If you go back to the Roman Empire, much of that was built on cheap labor. They called it slave labor. It was slave labor.
Right.
At some point, you have to have access to the energy that is critical to the manufacture and the development of your country. The Germans need it, and so do we. Everybody does. So I think this is going to stop. In other words, they say, when is this going to end? I think it's going to end as soon as the government falls in Berlin.
Okay.
I would put it that way.
Okay.
At that point, a new German government will come to power, and I think the indications are they'll say we need peace with Russia.
Right.
Now, this is very strange, too, because if you look at the Christian Democrats in Germany, they're supposed to be the alternative to the Social Democrats and the Greens and others.
Right.
They're talking about maintaining this hostile posture to Russia. I don't think that will last. I think the German people are going to say, for what purpose?
Correct.
How do we benefit, and what does this do for us? Poland is another one. Poland, of course, is very confused. The Poles, on the one hand, are torn between the past and the present. They want to be hostile to Russia, but they realize there's no future in it. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not necessary.
Right.
They don't want to be drawn into a war. I think they're also very tired of Ukrainianization. They've got so many Ukrainians in the country. They're turning into an extension of Ukraine in many places, and the Poles don't like it. Gee, what a surprise. I don't think we should be surprised by that.
Right.
And again, the whole world is watching us. This is the thing that's so striking about Europe. The Europeans have followed us blindly for years.
Correct.
I guess if you're going to argue who won hearts and minds after the Second World War, well, I guess we did. The problem is that we've been on the wrong road for 30 years. And once the Soviet state system collapsed and freedom broke out, people said, well, let's do what the Americans are doing. That it includes education. It includes industrial development. It includes scientific research, social organizations, societal structures. Big mistake. I think Europeans are going to figure that out. But until they really take a decisive turn away from the current governments, in other words, the governments. Modern society without it. You know, if you go back to the Roman Empire, much of that was built on cheap labor. They called it slave labor. It was slave labor.
Right.
At some point, you have to have access to the energy that is critical to the manufacture and development of your country. The Germans need it, and so do we. Everybody does. So I think this is going to stop. In other words, they say, when is this going to end? I think it's going to end as soon as the government falls in Berlin.
Okay.
I would put it that way.
Okay.
At that point, a new German government will come to power, and I think the indications are they'll say we need peace with Russia.
Right.
Now, this is very strange, too, because if you look at the Christian Democrats in Germany, they're supposed to be the alternative to the Social Democrats and the Greens and others.
Right.
They're talking about maintaining this hostile posture to Russia. I don't think that will last. I think the German people are going to say, for what purpose?
Correct.
You know, how do we benefit, and what does this do for us? Poland is another one. Poland, of course, is very confused. The Poles, on the one hand, are torn between the past and the present. They want to be hostile to Russia, but they realize there's no future in it. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not necessary.
Right.
They don't want to be drawn into a war. I think they're also very tired of Ukrainianization. They've got so many Ukrainians in the country. They're turning into an extension of Ukraine in many places, and the Poles don't like it. Gee, what a surprise! I don't think we should be surprised by that.
Right.
And again, the whole world is watching us. You know, this is the thing that's so striking about Europe. The Europeans have followed us blindly for years.
Correct.
I guess if you're going to argue who won hearts and minds after the Second World War, well, I guess we did. The problem is that we've been on the wrong road for 30 years. And once the Soviet state system collapsed and freedom broke out, people said, well, let's do what the Americans are doing. That it includes education. It includes industrial development. It includes scientific research, social organizations, societal structures. Big mistake. I think Europeans are going to figure that out. But until they really take a decisive turn away from the current governments, in other words, the governments are voted out of office, you get a no confidence vote.
Right.
Nothing of significance is going to change. But Berlin is still ultimately, I think, the key to everything that happens in Europe. Now, some people disagree and say, well, the French are always the bellwether because they're the first to revolt. That's true.
Right.
And I think the French, in their behavior, have made it easier for other Europeans to now stand up for themselves and defend themselves. But Germany is still the keystone in the edifice. And of course, all of this goes back to NATO. And you have to stop and ask yourself the question, watching Ukraine and its behavior, why would we want a rogue state like that inside the alliance?
Right.
And again, this belies the sort of, or reveals the lie about the alliance. It was always supposed to be defensive. It's been turned into a Trojan horse for American offensive operations.
Correct.
I don't know that most Europeans want to sign on for that.
Everyone, today was part one of a two-part series with Colonel Doug.